So number 26, we have several rational expressions, fractions, and notice what the question asks. It only says to find the values of x that make the expression undefined. All right. Now I give you 4 practice problems here. You only need to, there's only going to be one of them on the final. I want to do maybe 1, maybe 2. Anyway, what would make this undefined? Well, you got to look at your denominator and set each one of these guys equal to 0. So first of all, if I did have x minus 3, if it did equal 0, then that would make it undefined because 0 times anything would be 0, and you can't have 0 in the denominator. So if you solve that, plus 3, your answer will be x equals 3. That value will make this fraction undefined. This is not an answer. After all, this is not even an equation, right? It doesn't say equals something. It's not asking you to solve. It's only asking you for what values will this rational expression become undefined. So yeah, x equals 3, that's one value that'll mess it up. Now the other one, the x squared minus 16, let's factor it so we could see it clearly what values will mess it up. So what times what is negative 16 that if you combine together it gives you the middle value, which is nothing?
Negative 4, negative 4.
Thank you very much. That is a negative 4 and positive 4. That's right. Negative 4 times positive 4 is negative 16. If you combine it together, it does cancel out. So if you separate those guys and you say x minus 4 equals 0 and x plus 4 equals 0, and you'll get your two answers. X equals 4. Wait, I shouldn't say answers. X equals negative 4. You get the values that will make it undefined. Okay, so when they say what values make it undefined, 3 will mess it up, 4 will mess it up, or even negative 4 will mess it up. I mean, look at it. If you plug in negative 4 right here, negative 4 squared is positive 16. Minus 16, it'll make it 0. Makes the whole thing undefined. You guys cool with that? Should we see another example or just move on? Move on? You sure? Like I said, it's not an equation, and on this question, it specifically says, identify the values that'll make it undefined. Obviously, I made these questions straight from the final. I looked at the question on the final. I worded it exactly the same. So this is what you're going to see. It's not something that you could solve. They just want you to find the values that mess it up, that make it 0 in the denominator. So right here, on part B, I'll just do one more. X plus 2, if you set that equal to 0, you know that x equaling negative 2 will mess up that whole thing, right? Now the other one's not so clear because you could factor that other one, and what is it? What times what is 4 that if you add together is 4? 2 and 2, right? So on these guys, when you split these guys, set them each equal to 0, you're going to get the same answer twice. X plus 2 equals 0. X plus 2 equals 0. Kind of pointless because you're only going to get one answer that's repeated twice, which is x equals negative 2. And you know what? It's actually repeated 3 times. So what value will make this undefined? All you say is negative 2. Negative 2 will mess up this whole fraction. It's the only number that'll mess it up. Any other number works. So even though we got 3 answers here, or not 3 answers, but yeah, 3 values, they're all the same value. So x equals negative 2 messes this one up. You guys could practice with the other ones. Let's move on. Okay, finally moving on to stuff that we're a little more familiar with. It's pretty easy to multiply and divide fractions. All you got to do is factor everything possible and then cancel anything possible, right? So is there anything that we could factor on this first fraction? Well, we can't pull out anything from the denominator, but up here, there is no GCF that you could pull out, but you should recognize that 36 is a perfect square number. X squared, that's a perfect squared term. So this whole first term is a perfect squared term. And not only that, the 1 is also a perfect squared term, right? It's kind of like if we had, you guys remember this? X squared minus 9. What does that factor to, guys? X plus 3 minus 3, right? Okay, so this is a perfect squared term. 9's a perfect squared term. So it's kind of like if you, in your head, you square root x squared, you get x. You square root 9, you get 3. And because there is no middle term, one has to be plus, one has to be minus. So we're going to use that concept of the difference of two squares to be able to factor the above fractions. So on the numerator, 36x squared minus 1. What's the square root of 36x squared? 6x. What's the square root of 1? 1. So the square root of 36x squared, 6x, square root of 1 is 1. Now, of course, what signs belong in there? If this last term is a minus 1, could it be positive 1 times positive 1 to give you a minus 1? No. Or negative 1 times negative 1 to give you a minus 1? No. One has to be plus, and one has to be negative. That's right. Plus and minus, or minus and plus. It doesn't even matter. Anyways, we factored the top. The bottom, like we said, we couldn't do anything to, so we have 3x minus 1 times, over here, let's first start out by recognizing that the 1 and the 3x are out of order, so let's switch them. But when we switch them, that minus sign belongs to the 3x. So when I switch, I'm going to write it as negative 3x plus 1. Okay? Now that negative 3x, if I notice down here in the factored form of this first fraction, we have a positive 3x, but that's a negative 3x. We have a negative 1, but that's a positive 1. So what I could do right here when I rewrite it is I could factor out a negative 1. So if I pull out a negative 1, what would be left on the inside of this guy up on top? 3x minus 1. And of course, you have a 3x minus 1 on the bottom, a 3x minus 1 on the top. You will cancel those out. But let me first rewrite the bottom. This 6x minus 1, there's nothing to do right here. So I'm just going to rewrite it, 6x minus 1. So we factored everything possible. And now let's cancel things out. So the 6x minus 1 on top cancels with the 6x minus 1 on the bottom. The 3x minus 1 on top cancels with the 3x minus 1 on the bottom. So what's left over, you have the parenthesis 6x plus 1 up on top, and there's also a minus 1 out there that you need to multiply by, and there's nothing left on the bottom, so I wouldn't even write a 1 on the bottom. I would just leave it blank. You don't need to write anything anymore. It's no longer a fraction. And technically, you could put it over 1 if you wanted to. But anyways, we're going to distribute this negative 1 times 6. You're going to get negative 6x. Negative 1 times 1, that's negative 1. You get negative 6x minus 1 as your final answer on simplifying that rational expression. Got it? And you guys could practice with part B right there. Let's move on to 28a. So again, always factor everything possible. And if we look at the numerator up here, that's a quadratic trinomial. So let me first start by rewriting my fraction bar. And let me write parentheses here. Hopefully we could actually factor this. So x times x gives me x squared. The a value is 1. That's why it's so easy to start factoring. What times what is negative 12? That if you add together is negative 1. Negative 4 times positive 3. Okay? So there it is factored. Now right here, this bottom quadratic trinomial, let's also try to factor it. Put an x and an x and think what times what is 4 that if you combine together is negative 5. Well, that'll be a negative 4 times a negative 1. That will give you a positive 4, and if you combine them, it does give you a negative 5. Now, over here, you have a division sign. So the first thing to do is to take this division sign and rewrite it as multiplication, but you need to switch the above fraction, okay? So over here, let me start by switching the above fraction right next to it. So I'm going to have the 5x minus 5 up on top and the x squared minus 9 on the bottom. Now, let me write my new division bar, because as I bring them down, I'm going to factor them. So the 5x minus 5, what could I pull out of the top? I could pull out a 5. And if I pull out a 5 from the top, what's going to be left? X minus 1, correct? X minus 1. Okay, now the bottom one, x squared minus 9, that could factor into the parenthesis situation. It's a difference of two squares. And we all should know that that's a minus 3 plus 3, or plus 3 minus 3. It doesn't matter. Anyways, now they're completely factored. Now we have multiplication. We already flipped the second fraction. Let's just start canceling things out. So we have a x minus 4 on top that cancels with the x minus 4 on the bottom. We have an x minus 1 on top that cancels with the x minus 1 on the bottom. We have an x plus 3 on top that cancels with the x plus 3 on the bottom. So our final answer, what's left over up on top, there's a beautiful 5. On the bottom, you have the x minus 3, and there's nothing else to do. That's your answer. You guys could try part B. Let's move on to 29. 29 is a little bit more challenging because we are adding and subtracting fractions, all right? Now, in order to add and subtract fractions, you need a common denominator. So let's take a look at all of our terms. There's only monomials here, so it's easy. 6, 3, 10. What would your LCD be if you wanted a lowest common denominator? What would it be with 6, 3, and 10? Help me out here. Anybody? 30. And of course, we need some W's. So we're going to say that the LCD is 30W. 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 So I'm rewriting all of these fractions. Now between the first one there's a minus, second one there's a plus. So there are our new denominators. So what do we do to this 6 to make it a 30W? We multiply by what? 5W. So we multiply the top by 5. That's an ugly 5W. So 5W times 1, that's just 5W up there. Okay, now what do we do to the 3W to change it to a 30W? Multiply by what? 10. Multiply by 10. So you're going to go times 10 times 10. So you get 20 up here. And last but not least, what do you do to this 10W to make it a 30W? You multiply it by 3, and you multiply it by 3, so you get a nice beautiful 6 up here. Now that we have a common denominator on all three fractions, we can now write all the numerators together, adding and subtracting, in other words, combining like terms. Our final answer will be over that 30W. So 5W, take away 20, I can't really do that, but minus 20 plus 6, I could do that. What's minus 20 plus 6? Minus 14. What do I do with the 5W? I simply bring it down because I can't really take away 14 from 5W. So ladies and gentlemen, this is our answer for this problem. Now it would have been a different story if this would have been a 15. Then I could factor out a 5, and then I could cancel out the 5 with the 30 and reduce further. But there's nothing else to factor. We are done. And of course, you guys could practice with option B right there. These next ones are even more interesting because you have to get a common denominator on both of these guys first, ignoring the bottom one for a while, common denominator, and you subtract them, and you get an answer, which is going to be a fraction. Then you'll have your answer divided by another fraction, which means you're going to have to change it to multiplication and take this fraction here and flip the second fraction and write it horizontally. But I'm going to save that for the next video.